Hello and welcome. My name is Jennifer Gates, Field Services Director for the California Preservation Foundation. We want to thank you for joining the third webinar in the California State Historical Building Code series entitled Accessibility and Historic Landscapes, and encourage you to become a member of CPF and enjoy the benefits and educational discounts. Information on membership can be found on our website at www.californiapreservation.org. The California Preservation Foundation is a membership-based, not-for-profit organization whose mission is to provide statewide leadership in education and advocacy to ensure protection of historic resources in California. The format for today's webinar will include a presentation followed by time for questions and answers. There is a toolbar on the right side of your screen. If you have a question at any time during the presentation, please type it in the box and we will hold the question until the end for the presenter to answer. You will be muted throughout the presentation. To unhide this toolbar, click on the orange arrow. Please adjust your volume at this time on your computer or phone. Today's presentation will be by Douglas Nelson. Mr. Nelson is a historical landscape architect whose work is focused in sensitive and significant natural, cultural, and scenic resource environments. His work includes extensive experience in the analysis and treatment of cultural landscapes, including National Historic Landmark and National Register of Historic Places properties. He has been involved with the preservation of San Francisco's Golden Gate Park for many years, including preparing the park's first comprehensive master plan and the successful National Register of Historic Places nomination. Doug's work includes several significant projects at Yosemite National Park, including the Glacier Point, Olmsted Point, and Tunnel View Overlook rehabilitation projects. Other historic landscape work has included projects at the Presidio of San Francisco, Golden Gate National Recreation Area, Point Reyes National Seashore, San Francisco's Palace of Fine Arts, and numerous other state and local parks. He is a principal at the firm RHAA Landscape Architects, and he is also an instructor in cultural landscapes at the University of California, Berkeley Extension. Thank you for joining us today, Doug.
Well, thank you, Jennifer, and welcome to everyone. We're hopefully going to cover some ground that perhaps you've not heard before, hopefully this will be of interest to everyone. We're going to be traveling some ground that I think has really not been tread. The California Historic Building Code is, it actually covers a lot of areas. However, I think that it has not been used in landscape applications very much. I think there's very little track record of that, but I think that the opportunity is there, and that's part of what we're going to talk about today. And although the title is Accessibility and Historic Landscapes, we're actually going to be covering some additional areas beyond accessibility that I believe that the Historic Building Code actually can have an impact on. Just brief introduction, historic and cultural landscapes. These can include a wide variety of properties, historic sites, historic design landscapes, historic vernacular landscapes, and these may include urban landscapes, industrial landscapes, agricultural landscapes, and ethnographic landscapes. Most of us, and we'll be dealing with one of the first three, and those are the ones that are most applicable to the Historic Building Code. And I hope that many of you were in the previous two seminars in this series, but I do want to I'll just cover very quickly, just a little bit about the California Historic Building Code. The name is a little bit confusing because it's not a separate code, and that's sort of an important point. But it's part of the California Building Code, and so it's part of the regular code. It's a separate section, and it's part of Title 24, and this is Part 8. The application of the Historic Building Code is mandatory by the statute by all California agencies and jurisdictions. The question of what properties are eligible, and then in particular, how are landscape sites and districts included in the qualified properties. The code does mention specifically sites, places, locations, districts, collections of structures, and their associated sites. So it's a pretty broad definition that should include any type of historic property really that we're dealing with, any type of landscape, district, outdoor space. All of those should be considered qualified properties. The next level is what determines historic or not, and the California Historic Building Code has a fairly broad definition that includes properties on or determined eligible for national, state, or local historic registers or inventories, and that includes local inventories, county registers, city registers, and really anything that has had some professional documentation and determination of eligibility. So that's a fairly broad, also a broad net that can be cast. And I do want to emphasize, though, that if you have a property that you're thinking about working with or considering or protecting, it is important to have a determination of eligibility at least, if it's not already on a state or local or national register. Sorry, I went backwards by accident. This is just some of the language from this Chapter 8 of Title 24, and there is some particular language that relates to landscapes, including associated historical features of qualified historical buildings or properties such as historical districts that are beyond the buildings themselves, natural features, design site and landscape plans with natural and man-made landscape elements, site plan layout configurations or relationships. It talks about landscape elements, plant materials, site structures, and other qualified historical other than the qualified historical building. Bridges, their associated structures, lighting, water features, art ornamentation, pedestrian, equestrian, and vehicular surfaces. Also functional elements such as utilities, erosion control, and environmental mitigation measures. So they've tried to draft this really quite broadly. So it should not be too difficult to adapt a historic property to use by the Historic Building Code. In the languages purpose and intent, and this, interestingly, this language actually changed in the most recent revision to the Historic Building Code. And they talk about, in the new language, they talk about requiring enforcing agencies to accept solutions that are reasonably equivalent to the regular code. And that term, solutions that are reasonably equivalent, obviously is subject to perhaps debate, but the previous language in the previous version was alternative solutions, and I kind of like that term better, but I think that they were probably, tightening up the language here and making it a little bit less flexible, I think. So now, whatever solutions are looked for, they need to be reasonably equivalent to the regular code. And the next thing I wanted to talk about is regular code. What does that mean? Regular code, and this is sort of an unfortunate term, but it's sort of everything else other than the Historic Building Code, I think is really what they're referring to. But even broader than that, it does not just refer to the California Building Code. The language here, as in the lower part, the definition is regulations that govern the design and construction or alteration of non-historical buildings and properties within the jurisdiction of the enforcing agency. So what I read there is that this includes any kind of regulation, ordinance that has to do with construction, alteration. So, and I'm going to show a few of those coming up. So that's an important point, though, not just California Building Code. So some of the potential site and landscape applications of the California Historical Building Code, obviously accessibility, and that's one we're going to talk about. And that may include things like path of travel. In particular, a common thing in dealing with historic properties is providing a route that is perhaps less than the direct route and possibly not to a main entrance. And those are sensitive subjects, but when we're protecting and preserving historic resources, that comes into play quite a bit. We'll show some examples of that. Surface materials, and this is another one of those areas that is somewhat controversial. A lot of times, particularly in outdoor and landscape settings, we like to use things other than hard pavement, concrete or asphalt or stone. We like, decomposed granite or other granular surfaces. And typically, those do not meet the definitions for accessibility, and the surfaces need to be firm and non-skid. And the non-skid part is the tough part because any kind of granular surface usually has small particles on the surface, and those typically do not meet the non-skid test. Handrail design is another opportunity perhaps for some alteration from the existing regulations. Typically, it's not for increased slope. Typically we're not going to be able to increase the slope of paths. That is pretty inviolate, and there are some very brief exceptions that are actually written into the historic building code, but typically we're going to work with the existing slopes that are required for accessibility. Here are some of the other applications of the California Historic Building Code for landscapes, as I believe, and if anyone has either other examples or maybe begs to differ on any of these, I'd like to hear about that. But one of them is easing of fire access requirements, which are often things like 20-foot clear, pathways that are needed to move fire trucks and emergency vehicles into a property, and that's typically what the code reads, 20-foot clear. But if we're preserving, if we have historic gates or trees or other landscape features that would be difficult to get the 20-foot clearance, I think that the California Historic Building Code can be used to protect, or at least try to negotiate on those issues. Of course, you need to provide access, and so we need to determine what the minimum required. Usually, it's probably a minimum of 12 feet would be the absolute minimum, but that's one opportunity. Fire safety clear zones, and this is one that I'm going to talk about a little bit further, but I do mention that this is a high risk. This is more and more in California, particularly in urban wildland interface zones, which actually can be quite prevalent. I live here in Mill Valley, and I'm surprised to learn that really most of the city, except for the small area in the valley part, the flat areas, most of the city is in this zone, which they have some quite severe restrictions on vegetation in clear zones, and just how that would work with historic properties is going to be an interesting one. Variance from street and sidewalk standards, and that's one that I'll have an example of that. there are banned plans to preserve historic. Some cities have banned plants such as pollen violators or invasive species, and I think there's an opportunity if the plants are considered historic or integral to the design that there may be some application of the California Historic Building Code to save those. Another one is regulatory reductions of lawn. In California, here we have relatively new AB 1881, which is the Model Water Efficient Landscape Ordinance, a statewide ordinance that requires all cities and counties to have a water efficient landscape ordinance, and there are a number of requirements as part of that, but one of them is reduction of lawn, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit further in one of the projects. So the California Historic Building Code does not provide for specific remedies for landscape issues, but rather provides an opportunity for alternative solutions. So, and there's that term. I did use that term, alternative solutions, from the old language, but I think that it's descriptive, and it is an opportunity because I think that you would have to, as you can see, there isn't language that's specific about a lot of these issues. But if you read into it, I think that the language will allow it to be applied to many of these situations. As I said, there's really not much track record of use of the California Historic Building Code in landscape applications. So you really need to be creative and you need to be persuasive. So you really need to understand, educate yourself about it, because in all likelihood, with the lack of track record, you're going to have to be educating building and regulation officials about it. So, in fact, I talked recently, like with the water district here that has the local ordinance here, and they are certainly not experts on historic preservation. That's not what they do. They probably know very little about the California Historic Building Code. So it's really upon us. If we have a project that we're working on and we're working with these agencies, it's really upon us to educate them. And always the intent must be towards compliance with regulations and code, not just avoidance. That's a key point. And Peyton Hall in the previous webinar, he talked a lot about accessibility, and he said that it's really incumbent upon us to make sites and make buildings accessible, and I think that that's very true. So you don't want to use the code, historic building code, to make things less than fully accessible. But there are a lot of details in the guidelines for accessibility, and that's where we think there is some opportunity. Most of these applications involve health and safety issues that may require risk assessment. And this is in two ways. One is just, is there any, in preserving historic features, is there any safety issue for the public or property owners? You definitely want to make sure, especially where there is some variance from the regular code, you want to be very careful. And that includes, documenting and sharing decision-making with your clients and the agencies that you're working with, presenting options, allow the clients to make decisions, carefully weigh any exceptions to fire regulations. I'll talk about that in just a minute. Of course, if you're a design professional, manage your professional liability and manage your exposure to litigation. And you probably know that accessibility is one of those areas that has, because it is a civil rights law and not, it really has just attracted a lot of litigation, and so you need to manage that. I do want to talk about the fire issue a little bit. And there is some opportunity, and this is where the building and building design, if that's involved in a project, and the landscape design may come into play. If we have a historic property in the landscape and we have vegetation, trees in particular that are large and old but are right adjacent to the building, that's a fire issue. And they probably wouldn't allow those trees to be planted now. If they're already existing, they may be allowed to remain. If a particular tree is a character-defining feature and it dies, and then you want to replant it, that might be an issue. But there may be an opportunity, and the reason I bring this up is that the firefighters are out there during an event. They are out there, and what they do is they triage. They triage structures that they can save, and they triage structures that they feel that they cannot save. And when you have a structure that may not be meeting all of the clearance and vegetation clearance issues, that may be a real problem. And so I definitely want to bring that up, and that any regulations or exceptions to the fire regulations need to be carefully weighed. One opportunity, though, that I'll mention is that, again, this is a historic structure that we're talking about. It may have, roofing materials are often the biggest issue in historic structures. And if there is an opportunity to either switch to a material that, is either metal or a less prone to fire material, you might have an opportunity by having a fireproof roof of perhaps saving some of the adjacent vegetation if that's what's desired. So that's just a possibility for consideration. I'm just going to go into some case studies and just show a few examples. This is the Fay Garden in San Francisco, and this is a Tommy Church garden, and this was a private residence, and it was donated to the city, and it has now become a city park, which brings with it a whole bunch of issues such as accessibility that obviously were not present when it was a private garden, but yet they want to preserve the historic design. It's a terraced garden, which making it all the more challenging. As you can see, there's an upper garden on the right and a lower terrace on the left, and steps in between, essentially. So really the challenge is how do you have public space allow access to both the upper and lower areas and not destroy the garden. In this case, the size of the site, if you were to put in ramps, you would destroy the site. So that would sort of be counterproductive. Just some views of the upper terrace, which, it's quite a nice area. And I'll just mention this is one of the few Tommy Church gardens that is actually open to the public on a permanent basis, or maybe the only one. So this is a plan of the garden, and I'll just point to the two arrows. The solution here was to not have an internal circulation that was accessible, but to do it externally. So there were two gates from the street, and this is the lower gate and essentially the primary gate, and it was given a little more distinctive design. And then the upper gate was somewhat understated, just so there's not confusion as to where people should generally enter first. Another view of the upper gate. And this is a view along the street. Now you might notice that this street is not very flat, as is typical in San Francisco, but this was determined the best way, and this is something of a compromise. I would call this an alternative solution but this was a way to provide access and to preserve the resource. And that's one of the really, I think the key of the California Historic Building Code is to allow for things like this. And sidewalks, by the way, are exempt from accessibility regulations because they essentially, they are what they are. And if it's on a hill, it's not going to be, you're not going to be able to change the grade of a sidewalk. I believe that they did put, it's not in this photo, but I believe after this photo was taken, I think that they did install an accessible parking space right where that white car is. So, which even it does not meet, it's technically too steep for an accessible space, but that way there would at least be an accessible space, parking space. One more view of the two gates. I just wanted to throw this in, San Francisco City Hall. This is one of the best solutions that I've seen, and it's also one of the earliest. I think that this may have been done even before the ADA was passed as a law. Obviously monumental Beaux-Arts design with a grand staircase on both sides at the main entry. This is the Van Ness side. And you don't want to, you really don't want to change that. That's really a character-defining feature of the building and the site. So the solution here, really, I thought was, it is a very elegant one, and although it's an old example, I think that it's a very good one. From the street, as you can see here, they have turf, and I'm sure that this whole area probably was turf originally before they put the ramp in, and the new ramp, they were able to fit it in, and they put back turf, and they put back a hedge in front of it. So from the street, really what you see is turf and hedge, which really preserves, excuse me, preserves the historic design. Now, interestingly, I think that this, I don't know if they altered this when they rebuilt City Hall or not, or if this was, maybe this was done when they built that, but I don't know that this ramp actually meets the current regulations in terms of a landing area in the middle, but perhaps it doesn't need it, but it's always a good example of a well-done entry. The other thing I'll just point out about this entry is that it brings people to the front door, to the main entrance, and that's, rather than a side entrance, that's a real plus for this design also. This is the music concourse in Golden Gate Park, and this underwent a major, about $15 million renovation in conjunction with the reconstruction of the two museums. And this is the Temple of Music in the background, and the area here was, historically was this decomposed granite. And this is one of those places where decomposed granite, is an issue. It's typically maintenance people don't like it, but it's really a very lovely material. It's nice to walk on. It looks good. If anybody has been to Paris or, other European cities, London, it's used a lot. The Tuileries Gardens in Paris are full of it. It's just a very nice, elegant solution where you don't necessarily want a lot of paving and where trees are growing and you don't really need hard paving. But the issue is accessibility. As I mentioned, the decomposed granite generally can meet the firm, stable criteria for accessible surfaces, but it really can't meet that non-skid requirement because of the particles on the surface. Now, this will vary by jurisdiction. San Francisco is very strict about the accessibility regulations, and they review every project very closely. And this was not going to fly as an accessible surface. And of course, this is a very major facility and programming which was required to be accessible. These are the benches for the music programs, and they're just sitting right on the decomposed granite, and that's how firm it is, that, you know, the benches are perfectly fine sitting on this material. But it is a problem for accessibility, at least in a technical standpoint. Somebody in a wheelchair probably wouldn't have any problem, but it doesn't meet those that non-skid issue. So what was the solution here was including this central pathway, which was not in this location. There was no central pathway here, but it was an extension of the existing paving in the music concourse, and it, you know, looks fairly consistent with the historic design. And then also they added pads for wheelchairs to be sitting at least next to the benches. And this is sort of a design. Most benches now, you know, we always try and provide wheelchair space. This is not the most elegant solution to that, but it provides space for wheelchairs outside of the circulation zone. This is another small issue in the music concourse, but one that I think was solved in really a bit more of an elegant solution. There are three of these fountains in the center of the music concourse, and the fountains, which were actually recently restored and reactivated, had this cobble ring around them. The cobble edge is really too rough to be accessible, but to allow wheelchairs, people in wheelchairs, to access the water and the water edge, they provided a smooth area that, you know, is similar to the cobble paving, so it looks compatible. They also worked it in where this is where the drains are, so it looks a little even more even more like it belongs, but it's just a very simple solution that solves the problem of accessibility and yet retains the majority of the historic materials. This is a plan of the music concourse, and as you can see, you know, it is a formal design. It's a Beaux-Arts design with lots of formal axes, and everything lines up, except for the two museums, which are not on the same axes. But the central area of the music concourse, you know, has these formal, the fountains, the Temple of Music on the left, the Key Memorial on the right, all line up, and, you know, this is very elegant and very typical of Beaux-Arts type design. But one of the issues is how do you deal with accessibility? And the problem is that if you've been there, or perhaps some of you haven't, the center of the concourse is lower, and it's about, I think it's probably about 12 feet below the rim, the street level, and the upper promenade here. So in between the two are these steps, and going down into the lower concourse, and obviously we need to have connections down. And the experience, you know, really one of the nice things is experience the design. You experience the vistas and the axes and the lines. And I think that that's really one of the, you know, that experience is important to people that visit. And able-bodied people can go up and down the stairs. The stairs are on the axes, and you get to fully experience that. You know, as is often the case, the accessible route may not be the most direct route, and that's unfortunate, but that's, you know, sometimes cannot be avoided. So typically, as really is required, there would be signage to direct people to accessible routes. And in this case, you know, there are ramps that go down from the upper concourse to the lower concourse, providing that accessibility. One of the nice things about this design is that it does bring the wheelchair users onto the axis of the stairways, and so they do get to experience that axis view that you have as you're walking down the stairs. In this case, the landing between the stairs is the landing from one ramp to the other. This is the Presidio of San Francisco and the Montgomery Street Barracks, which have just very recently been rehabilitated. The one on the right is actually the Walt Disney Family Museum, and that's been open for a couple of years. The one next to it and the one in the foreground, those have just reopened after extensive work. You can imagine brick structures and making them seismically fit. But the structures, and these were barracks where the troops lived, and they had some formalized design. And I think that the design was that each side was a company or something to that effect of one of the units in the Army. And they had, as you can see, they had separate stairways. The buildings were divided in two, and they had separate entrances and stairways. And those stairways in that porch really are very integral to the design. And you know, obviously, they need to be made accessible. That was not an issue when the Army was using them, and so that has to be accomplished. Now, in this case. You know, and you can see that the site is actually sloping. So there is one end that is closer to grade and then one end that is higher off the grade. So, you know, as the logical thing is to put this ramp entrance on the lower end, the end that is closest to the grade, and then have accessibility onto the porch. Now, unfortunately, that was not the only obstacle. Once you got on the porch, there was actually a full step into the building, which you can see here. And this was, I thought, you know, I'm just showing it because it's a fairly, I thought it was a very elegant solution. Just a very simple ramp, given some architectural articulation that, you know, makes it look like it belongs in this period. So you have it in a small ramp coming up, and yet it's visually hidden, and you accomplish the accessibility to the finished floor of the building. And I'm sure that they probably consider this as a reversible solution, although I'm sure it won't be going anywhere for a long time. This is another project a little bit unusual. This is the Mason Street at Crissy Field in the Presidio. You see Golden Gate Bridge in the background. And these are the former hangars for the aircraft that used to inhabit Crissy Field, and the landing strip was in the grassy area. And to a large degree, these buildings have been preserved. And one of the character-defining features of this cultural landscape is that these are hangars, and they wanted to preserve the feel of the hangar as much as possible. And one of the ways that they wanted to do that was to not have any grade changes. You know, obviously planes would be rolled right in, they'd be rolled off the field right into the hangars with no grade change, and that's the way, there never was a grade change. The Army, even after the airplanes were gone, the landscape really retained that lack of grade change, so there were no curves. You could still roll right in, and that was a really important factor. And yet the question is, how do we create, in this case, a streetscape? These buildings are repurposed for mostly for recreational type uses and a few other uses. So the public is here, there's a need for parking. It is essentially a streetscape, and yet we have accessibility regulations and safety issues that need to be addressed. So in this case, the solution was really, we didn't want to put curbs in. Curbs provide a safety and a definition between vehicles and pedestrian areas that simplify some of that distinction, but we didn't want curbs here. So the solution was to use these little freestanding wheel stops, which are actually made of recycled rubber, I believe. But then we still have the issue, and this is an accessibility issue that is maybe in flux a bit now. When this project was done just a couple years ago, there was this requirement that all of those division points between vehicle space and pedestrian space had to be protected by what's called detectable warnings, and you often see them. They're at the edge of transit platforms, and they're at the edge of, typically at the edge of accessible curb ramps. But even where you don't have curbs, the idea was that you should still have, well, as we're required by the accessibility regulations, to have detectable warnings. And the purpose of these is to help blind people know when they're leaving a pedestrian area and entering potential hazards of a vehicular area. Since this project was done, the federal guidelines have changed and they no longer require these. But this was a big part of this project. The state, by the way, the state of California has not removed the requirement for detectable warnings. So this is an issue that is a little bit in flux with the accessibility community and accessibility advocates. So just, you might keep this in mind and just be aware that this is an issue that might be changing or is in the process of changing. But this was, this was a fairly nice solution. We could preserve as much of the historic character as possible, not have this distinction between sidewalk and street defined by a grade change, which was important, and sort of maintain the industrial type setting here. A little better view of the detectable warnings. You can see the raised bumps in shadow here. And again, just defining pedestrian space and vehicular space. This is another project that really now, as we leave the realm of accessibility, I wanted to bring up this project. This is the Edge Hill Mansion at Dominican College in San Rafael. And, this is sort of a Victorian era landscape. And it was really predicated on, some very stately arboretum trees and lawn. And, this is the traditional setting, and it's a setting that this building was actually completely rehabilitated, and the landscape was rehabilitated with it. And this was a great opportunity, to preserve this really beautiful landscape. But we were up against the issue of the water conservation ordinance. As I mentioned, there is the statewide water conservation ordinance, and in this case, the Marin Municipal Water District monitors, and you have to submit plans. There are, regulations on the amount of lawn and the amount of water use overall, which is to some degree a function of the amount of lawn. But yet a very important character-defining feature of this landscape. Now, we were able to actually meet the guidelines. We actually reduced the lawn somewhat. As you can see, the areas around the trees, we peeled back the lawn and put in wood mulch. So we were actually able to achieve the guidelines with this project. But if we hadn't, I think that this is a good application of the State Historic Building Code. And you can see how integral, turf is to this landscape. So this is actually from the Marin Municipal Water District Water Conservation Code. But this language, most of this language is actually taken from the state ordinance, state regulation. And I was interested to find that there is an exemption. They have a list of exemptions of what landscapes are exempt from the Water Conservation Code. And I was surprised and pleased to learn that the registered local, state, or federal historic sites are exempt. However, the language here is registered local, state, or federal historic sites. And I checked, in this case, I don't think there is a definition beyond that. And, I'm sure that historic preservation advocates lobbied to have an inclusion of an exemption for historic sites. But the language here is registered, and I don't know, I'm not sure exactly how they are defining that, but it likely means listed on a register. And as you saw earlier, the California Historic Building Code qualification is eligible for or on registers. So the language here is a little bit of an issue, and many historic properties, I don't know what the percentage, I'd be curious to find out what the percentage, but many historic properties are not formally listed on a state or local or federal register, and yet they are very significant, and for a variety of reasons they are not on those registers. But so I think that it's important here, and I would make the argument that this is a case where the State Historic Building Code would actually kick in. And I think that if you have a property that is determined eligible for a register, then I think that it would be exempt. But you would have to make that argument. There would have to be some discussion, and who knows what the agency would determine. But I think that this is a place where you would have that argument, or at least discussion. Persuasive discussion, in the case where you need to, and you're dealing with people that are their job is water conservation, not historic preservation. So, they may likely have not even heard of the California Historic Building Code. So this is where that education process is important. I just wanted to show this diagram, and this is a typical. This fire clear zone setback, and typically they want almost nothing within the first 30 feet from a structure, and that would include, you could do lawn and low ground covers, but minimal shrubs and trees. I think that you can have some shrubs, but they should not be large and massive and not contain a lot of fuel. Beyond that, the 70 30 to 70 foot diameter from a, you can have trees, but they need to be separated and limbed up. And this is the kind of regulation that, is very important. I mean, as we've all seen plenty of fires in California, this is a very important issue. And as I mentioned, more importantly is the perception of the firefighters, because if you have a property that, has some issues, when they are out there fighting, they will triage, and they may need to make quick decisions about what structures they can save and what structures they can't. So if you have a historic structure, but it is, as often the case, surrounded by trees and lots of vegetation, and often flammable roofing materials, they are not going to, if it's an emergency situation, they may not be able to fight to save that structure. So this is really an important point. I think that factors like the roof material really could play in, where maybe you could have some additional vegetation around the building if the roofing material is fireproof. So that's I throw this out there as, I would use the California Historic Building Code very carefully here, but I think that it's an opportunity to look at. One other item, I mentioned the fire access codes, regulations, and typically 20-foot clear is what's required. And this is just an example. It's actually a historic road. It's no longer used as a road, but it is a park, and potentially this would likely be a fire access route or emergency access route, and they clearly did not have 20-foot clear here, but there may be, a vehicle may be able to get through. And so this is where you would, potentially use the California Historic Building Code to preserve the historic gate, preserve the historic resource, and yet still allow for the emergency access, which is critical. And this is a case where you will likely be negotiating this with the fire marshal that is reviewing plans. And, I would bring this to their attention and say, we have 20-foot clear, except at this point, and, can we preserve this gate? And, typically they, if they can get their trucks through, they will grant this exception. So an opportunity for using the California Historic Building Code. Just in summary, just to go back over the key points, the California Historic Building Code does not just apply to building code. It can apply to any building, site, or construction regulations. So, and I think you can use your imagination. I've mentioned a few, and I'm sure that there are others that may apply. So, use your imagination. There is a need to negotiate, educate, and work with building and regulatory officials, and really you want to develop a cooperative relationship with them. The goal, obviously, is to preserve historic resources. Alternative solutions must be towards compliance and not just avoidance, and that's really that's that part of the cooperative relationship that the regulatory and building officials, they're doing their job, and if you can show that you are working towards compliance, even though you may not be meeting the regular code exactly, that goes a long way. And again, provide for universal accessibility. I think that there's very little way that we want to use the building code to not have accessibility. We just want relief from some of the strict guidelines that come along with that. And finally, manage risks. That's in terms of safety to the property, to users, and perhaps to your professional liability. That concludes the presentation.
All right. Well, thank you.
Happy for some questions.
So yes, at this time, if you have a question, we do have some already, but go ahead and type in your questions into the box, and I will ask Doug them. So the first question is ADA compliance required on a historic project?
Well, I would say yes, and I think that Peyton Hall could probably answer that maybe more succinctly than I could, but you need to meet the intent of the ADA, and there are some broad perspectives such as equivalent facilitation, programmatic access. So we're dealing with I often deal with parks. You have to have at least some play equipment, for instance, be accessible, maybe not all of it, but you definitely need to have accessibility. You need to meet the spirit of the ADA, and I think that really there are some details in the guidelines that there may be some relief from, but you cannot avoid providing accessibility. So I think that you are required to meet ADA, and there is some variance, though, in how those requirements can be met.
Okay. The next question is, how does a water conservation ordinance affect school districts?
I don't have that in front of me, but there is a list of exempt properties, and I don't recall, but it's possible that schools may be one of those exempt types of landscapes. You would have to look, and you should check with your local either city or water agency, whoever is managing the ordinance. It's a state regulation, but essentially the state regulation requires the local jurisdictions to have a local ordinance, and they are able to, they have to meet the minimum requirements of the state ordinance, and then they can go beyond it if they so choose, but they have to meet minimum standards. So I can't answer your question specifically, but if you check with the ordinances are not very lengthy, and there is a particular section on landscapes that are exempt, and you should quickly be able to determine if schools are exempt or not.
Okay, next question is, can you repeat what the name of the sidewalk material, what you called it, for the distinction between vehicular access and pedestrian access?
Oh, well, there are a number of terms, but detectable warning strip is sort of, I think, the technical term that may be used. There are probably some other names for it also. Truncated domes is another name. You'll see the material particularly on curb cuts, curb ramps, at least curb ramps that have been built in the last few years. They typically have them there. Sometimes they're yellow. They may be other colors, but detectable warnings is the term that I used.
Okay. Next question is, can you elaborate on alternative solutions for compliance and not avoidance with an example?
Well, I think that's where, that goes to the accessibility. I think is the best example of that, is that you have to provide accessibility, and you have to do the best you can. And, which means you need to have a way to get into a building, for instance, from accessible parking, path of travel, from transit to a site, into the building. All of those they need to be accessible. There's no way around that. You cannot avoid that. There are some ways that, and you know, they're commonly used, and they're not necessarily invoking the California Historic Building Code, but in a historic building, let's just use the example of the San Francisco City Hall. You know, some advocate might say, well, I want to come in the front way, I want a ramp right in front of the building, but of course that would destroy the steps leading, those, you know, monumental steps leading into the main entry. Those monumental steps are a character-defining feature that you don't want to lose. That's very important to the historic design. And so the alternative solution is to put a pathway, a ramp on the side. Now, in this case, in the case of City Hall, it brought people right to the main entrance, so they were able to go in the same doors. And that's certainly a preferred solution. You know, there are some situations where even that's not possible, and sometimes the ramp goes to a side door or a back door. That's debatable, but if there is no other solution that would not result in the loss or significant loss of historic fabric, you know, that's where the Historic Building Code can come in. It's definitely a less than ideal accessibility situation, but yet you're making an accommodation because it is a historic structure or historic landscape.
Okay, the next question, or kind of a secondary question to that, is how do you justify replacing landscape to make accessible routes and paths?
Well, you know, it is, you are balancing historic fabric with the need for accessibility. And, you know, the need for accessibility is ultimate. There's no way around that. So, again, I would use just the example of the City Hall. You know, they took what was a turf area and they put the ramp in. They preserved some turf in front of the ramp, and they put in the hedge. So essentially, when you're in the street, the view, you don't see the ramp at all. What you see is turf and hedge. And I just think that's a very, you know, elegant way of preserving the historic design and yet incorporating the ramp. Now, yes, there is some loss of turf and some loss of historic plant material, but, you know, that's the price that we pay to you know, allow for accessibility. So it's a balance.
The next question is, can you discuss a little bit more the variances for sidewalk standards?
Those will vary, but the main point is that, you know, in many cases, in most cases, you would be required to have a 6-inch curb separating pedestrian and vehicular space. And in the case of Mason Street and Christie Field, you know, that was grading and grade changes, you know, really are those are character defining features for a landscape. And even something as small as a 6-inch curb can really change that whole character and result in a significant loss. And, you know, although nobody is running airplanes in and out of those hangars anymore, preserving that image that, you know, there is no grade change, and you could visualize how airplanes could, you know, in the past they did go in and out of those hangars. And so that's a very important, you know, and that was determined to be a really important aspect of that landscape. So I'm just trying to think. I don't know. I'm sure there are other street and sidewalk, you know, issues. Some places, you know, require particularly wide sidewalks, and, you know, that may or may not be consistent with the historic design, and that's where you may have to weigh the advisability of making a change to meet standards or looking for an alternative solution to what's required.
We have another question that I'm going to kind of rework and add to, and it's in regards to determining whether or not a site is historic, where you would find that list, or how that determination is made, especially with landscapes.
Okay. Well, typically you would, the state maintains a state register. They also, they also have a record of anything on the National Register of Historic Places or National Historic Landmarks. In the case of local, your city or county should have some kind of a historic either office or person, hopefully somebody that is knowledgeable and can tell you. And if a site is, and it's often the case, there are many, many historic sites, and I should just, I should just add that, as we go on in the future, sites that reach the age of either 45 or 50, depending on the jurisdiction, those sometimes become potentially historic when they reach the age of 45 or 50. So we potentially are gaining more historic sites every day. But if you're unsure about a particular property, I would start with the city or county and ask them if they have any record, if there are historic surveys. They often do. A lot of jurisdictions will do historic surveys that assess properties, and those may determine that a property is eligible, and so you may not even be aware. And that it goes for private and public, because there's no requirement for anybody's approval to have a site determined eligible. With private sites, there is the owner can refuse to have it actually listed, but in terms of public sites, they can be listed whether, if they meet the criteria and it's somebody is submitting it, it doesn't have to be granted by the agency that owns the property. But barring all that, if you don't find any help with from the city or the county, I would contact a historic preservation professional, and they can do an assessment and probably relatively simple and quick determine eligibility, or at least determine whether it's potentially historic. And again, you do need to have that distinction that it does need to have a determination that it is eligible for some historic record, whether it's a local, state, or national register or historic survey.
Okay, the next question is specific to a project. So the project is to replace and bring up to ADA standards a sidewalk that is not historic and is along a historic tree row on a busy city street. And the sidewalks, which again are not historic, have been pushed up by the tree roots. And are there any suggestions on how to protect the resource, being the trees, without grinding the protruding roots or otherwise damaging the trees?
Yeah, there's a lot of it's not an uncommon problem, and particularly where in this case, as you said, the actual paving is not historic. I would replace the paving, and you can you may need to fill and perhaps raise the paving just a little bit to avoid the roots, but you may have to plan on replacing that pavement again 10, 15, 20 or more years in the future, but you can replace that paving and hopefully do it in a way that does not threaten the trees, but yet you'd hopefully achieve your accessibility requirements. There are also some products that I've not used, but I've heard about, that some places there is a rubberized sidewalk product that is used or can be used around trees, and I've not really seen it, but it has that flexibility, and at least for a time, it at least provides a smooth surface, if not a flat surface, around trees.
Is that like the playground material? That kind of?
I think it's similar, but it's probably thicker.
Okay. The next question is, are there typical tree species that are characteristic of historic landscapes?
Well, that's a loaded question here in California. Well, I think there are many, and they really will vary, area by area. But the first one that comes to mind is eucalyptus, which is definitely historic, and and there is obviously some controversy with it being non-native, and some bad rap as to fire danger from it, but they can be very beautiful and very distinctive, and really character defining in certain settings. There are many trees, the oaks, particularly native oaks, are very evocative of many California landscapes. Then there's things like Monterey cypress. The landscape of Golden Gate Park is, it's really defined. Well, it's primarily eucalyptus, pine, and Monterey cypress, although the cypress have outlasted many of the pines and eucalyptus, and it's very evocative, and really gives that landscape a unique character, but it's not native there, and so you often run into issues of, is it native or not? But then the landscape of California, the native landscapes many times are treeless in many areas. So that's kind of a very broad question, and I would say, it really is dependent on the area where you are and that you're talking of. Obviously places in the desert, Joshua trees are, completely distinctive and native and historic. Palm trees, typically not native in most of California, but very distinctive, and they've been used for probably at least 150 years here and there. So many old examples. And I'll just say one thing about historic trees, because I do like to make the distinction that the actual tree doesn't necessarily, some are actually associated with a particular event or dedication or something, and so they may have some individual historic distinction, but trees come and go. They will die over time, and I hate to think that we lose historic integrity when we lose a tree. So really what I prefer to look at is the historic design, and if a particular tree was planted in a particular place and it dies, I would say we should replace that tree with an appropriate, either the same or an appropriate species.
All right. Are there any more questions? All right. Well, thank you again for joining us today. And later today, you'll receive an email with a link to a survey. We would appreciate any feedback on this webinar, as well as recommendations for future topics. I will also send an email with the final PowerPoint presentation. Please don't forget to sign in on the sign-in sheet and send it back to us if you have multiple people sending and watching today, or if you are requesting continuing education credits. And we hope that you have a good rest of the afternoon, and thank you again, Doug.
Thank you.